It's a quiet February afternoon in Albuquerque, New Mexico. A woman is out walking her dog along a stretch of dry desert land on the edge of the city. A place where the wind whips through the brush and the skyline is broken only by distant power lines. She isn't expecting to find anything out there. Most people don't come to this part of town at all. But what she stumbles upon that day will uncover one of the largest crime scenes in American history. What begins with a single bone leads detectives to a mass grave containing the remains of 11 women, all missing for years, all with stories that, for the most part, the world had stopped listening to. Over the weeks that follow, this quiet patch of sand and sagebrush becomes a sprawling excavation site. Hundreds of officers, forensic experts and volunteers working around the clock as the scale of the horror slowly comes to light. This is not a case of a single victim or even a single year. This is a case that stretches across years and through some of the most vulnerable lives in Albuquerque. And somewhere in the city's past, or perhaps still out there, is the person responsible. This is the story of the West Mesa Bone Collector. My name's Jack Lawrence. Welcome to Crime at Bedtime. Before we head back to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and the story of the Bone Collector, it's time to take a minute. Time to relax and focus on our breathing. As always, we'll utilize the 4-6-8 method. Breathing in slow and deep through the nose for 4 seconds. Holding the breath for 6, before breathing out slow and controlled for 8. Here we go. Breathing in for 4. Hold. And slowly and controlled back out. And again, slowly breathing in deep, filling the lungs for 4. Holding. And slowly and controlled back out again. One more time, breathing in deep, slow, through the nose, filling the lungs for 4 seconds. Holding for 6. And slowly and controlled back out again. Now, as you breathe normally, let's head back to the story of the West Mesa Bone Collector. In the early 2000s, Albuquerque, New Mexico was a city defined by contrasts. Downtown, new developments were pushing outward into the edges of the desert. Families were buying homes in expanding subdivisions. Children were playing on cul-de-sacs, and city leaders talked about growth. But a few miles away, beneath that surface of optimism, was another Albuquerque entirely. A place where addiction, poverty, and violence were part of everyday life. Along stretches like Central Avenue, the city's old Route 66, sex work and drug use were common. People disappeared here, and when they did, it rarely made the evening news. This landscape, quiet desert, transient communities, stretched policing. It was the perfect cover for a predator. To the west of Albuquerque, beyond the new housing estates, lies a stretch of dry, open land known as West Mesa. It's flat and exposed. On windy days, sand cuts through the air in thin ribbons. Power lines stand like sentries in the distance. In the early 2000s, few people walked out here. It wasn't a place for picnics or recreation. It was simply the edge, where the city stopped and the desert began. This area would later become infamous. But in 2003 and 2004, it was just empty ground. These are the years where methamphetamine use surged across Albuquerque. The epidemic hit particularly hard in vulnerable communities, pulling people into cycles of addiction and survival. Women involved in sex work were especially at risk. Many lived transient lives, bouncing between cheap motels, friends' apartments, and the streets. The disappearances often went unnoticed for days, sometimes even weeks. And even when families reported them missing, those reports didn't always receive the same urgency as others. Detectives who would later work the West Mesa case admitted that back then, missing sex workers rarely triggered major investigations. Many were assumed to have moved on, fallen out of touch, been arrested, or potentially overdosed. But that assumption would prove tragically wrong. Cinnamon Elks was 32 years old when she disappeared in 2004. She grew up in Albuquerque, and by the time she went missing, she was well known among people who lived and worked along Central Avenue. She had a quick wit and a sharp tongue. Even when her life became defined by addiction and the streets, people remembered her as someone who could light up a conversation. She wasn't invisible, at least not to those who shared the same sidewalks. Cinnamon had spoken to friends shortly before she vanished. She told them she thought someone was following her in the area. Girls were disappearing and no one seemed to care. No one knew exactly what she meant at the time. People along Central had heard rumors for years, but Cinnamon's warning was different. It was rather specific. And then, suddenly, she too was gone. Her family reported her missing, but without a body or evidence of foul play, the case went nowhere. And her name just joined an ever-growing list of women missing from Albuquerque streets. Michelle Valdez, just 22 years old when she disappeared in 2004. Unlike many others, her disappearance should have sounded alarms. She was pregnant at the time. Her family was close-knit, and they were terrified when she vanished. Michelle had been trying to get her life back on track, but like many of the victims who would later be found on West Mesa, she was caught in the cycles of addiction and survival that so often left women vulnerable. She was last seen in the South Valley of Albuquerque. When her family filed the missing persons report, they hoped that her pregnancy would at least make her case stand out. The police would search harder, look faster, and ask more questions. But nothing happened. Weeks passed, then months, and her family were the ones knocking on doors, calling jails, checking shelters and hospitals. For law enforcement, Michelle's case became one more file in an underfunded, overburdened system. But her father never stopped searching. By 2005, a quiet pattern had taken shape. One by one, women were disappearing from Central Avenue and the surrounding neighborhoods. Some of them were last seen near motels or walking down the street. Others simply stopped answering calls. Cinnamon's friends knew she'd been scared before she vanished. Michelle's family knew she would never have just walked away while pregnant. But without bodies, police didn't have a crime scene. Without physical evidence, they couldn't connect the cases. And without leads, they had nothing to pursue. And without pressure from the wider public, the story stayed on the margins. While these women disappeared, Albuquerque was focused on other problems. Violent crime was on the rise in other parts of the city. Drug enforcement consumed a huge chunk of police resources. The women missing from the streets were talked about in whispers, if at all. There were no press conferences, no nightly news coverage. Their families would put up flyers and made calls and simply just sat and waited. Their disappearances, like so many others in the margins of American cities, happened in plain sight. But in a city that wasn't looking for them, they were simply invisible. By the end of 2005, at least 11 women had disappeared. No major investigation connected their cases. No task force existed to search for them. The desert on the city's western edge remained silent, a place most people drove past without ever looking twice. But beneath that sand, the truth was already buried. Cinnamon Elks, Michelle Valdez, and 9 other women whose names would later shake Albuquerque to its core. No one could simply have imagined that 5 years after Cinnamon vanished, and the same for Michelle, that an unexpected dog walker would uncover the first signs of the graveyard beneath their feet. On the afternoon of February 2nd, 2009, the wind rolled steadily across the open desert west of Albuquerque. It was the kind of winter day that made the Mesa look endless. Dry earth broken by brittle weeds and the faint hum of power lines in the distance. Christine Ross was out walking her dog through an empty stretch of land near a housing development. Construction had crept closer to the Mesa in recent years, turning what had once been isolated scrub into a half-developed zone of paved roads, unfinished lots, and skeletal houses. Christine's dog ran a little ahead of her, nose down, tail stiff, then stopped abruptly and pawed at the sand. Christine caught up and froze. In front of her, partially sticking out of the earth, was a human femur. Christine immediately called police, and within minutes, Albuquerque Police Department units arrived on the scene. Officers set up a small perimeter around the bone and began the slow, careful process of securing the site. At first, no one on that scene knew what they were dealing with. It could have been an old burial, a single homicide maybe, a body dumped years ago. However, when cadaver dogs were brought in, they started alerting, again and again and again, across multiple points in the sandy soil. And that's when investigators realized that they were standing on top of something far larger. By nightfall, floodlights illuminated the scrubland. What had begun as one bone was now a major crime scene. The following morning, detectives returned with forensic anthropologists and crime scene technicians. The soft soil of the Mesa made digging relatively easy, but that also meant the remains were fragile. Investigators treated the site like an archaeological dig, carefully scraping away layers of earth, flagging each discovery with a small orange marker. It wouldn't take long before more human remains began to surface. One and then another, then another. Over the next few weeks, a large team of specialists from APD, the Office of the Medical Investigator, and volunteers from around the state worked the site methodically. They cleared brush, dug in measured grids, and marked every find. This wasn't just a grave, it was a mass burial site. Word spread quickly. Local reporters would arrive first, followed by national media. Helicopters hovering overhead, broadcasting aerial images of detectives combing through the sand. People who lived in the nearby housing developments walked to the edge of the police line, trying to glimpse what was happening. For families who'd spent years searching for missing loved ones, the news landed like a punch through the chest. They gathered at the perimeter with photos in hand, desperate to talk to detectives. This was the first sign of anything that they'd had in years of silence. A strange kind of hope. The crime scene on West Mesa eventually spanned approximately 100 acres, making it one of the largest homicide excavations in US history. Specialists mapped every square foot, establishing grid lines to ensure nothing was missed. The soil, dry and sandy, had preserved much of the skeletal material close to the surface, but time had scattered and fractured many bones, making recovery delicate work. The cadaver dogs continued to work and continued to alert throughout February. By March, more than a dozen sets of remains had been flagged. Investigators confirmed they belonged to multiple people, not just one, and nearly all of them were female. The scale of the site told detectives something chilling. Whoever had done this had returned multiple times, burying victims over a span of years. As remains were recovered, forensic anthropologists began the process of identification. Dental records and DNA cross-referenced against cold missing persons files from the early 2000s. Some families had kept dental records for years, hoping for closure. Others had to provide new DNA samples. The process was painstaking. However, slowly names began to emerge. Names like Cinnamon Elks, who was 32, Michelle Valdez, 22, and her unborn baby, Julie Nito, 24, Veronica Romero, 27, Victoria Chavez, 26, Virginia Cloven, 23, Monica Candelari, 22, Evelyn Salares, 27, Jamie Barella, just 13, and Solania Edwards, only 15. For many of these families, the phone calls from detectives didn't come with surprise. They came with the final confirmation of what they'd long feared. From the beginning, investigators noticed something deliberate about the burials. Each victim had been buried in a shallow grave, arranged in relative proximity to one another. The burials appeared to have happened at different times, some older, some more recent, suggesting an ongoing series of killings rather than a single event. The location itself made sense for someone trying to hide a crime. At the time of the killings, the area was remote and unlit. The nearest housing was miles away. Soil was loose, easy to dig and cover quickly. Forensic teams believe the killer was familiar with the area, possibly even lived or worked nearby. As the body count grew, so did public pressure. The families of victims demanded answers, and the media dubbed the unknown perpetrator the West Mesa Bone Collector, a name that would stick. The city was on edge. Albuquerque had seen violence before, but nothing to this scale. The idea that a serial killer had been able to operate for years, leaving bodies in the desert without anyone noticing, rattled the residents. Meanwhile, law enforcement raced to preserve and catalogue every piece of evidence they could find. But they faced a grim reality. The killings had likely taken place between 2001 and 2005. 4 to 8 years had passed. Time had stripped away trace evidence like clothing fibers, DNA, or anything that could directly point to a killer. By the end of March 2009, the excavation was complete. 11 women and 1 unborn child had been recovered. The site was cleared, mapped and documented down to the inch. But despite the scale of the operation, investigators had no suspect, no eyewitnesses, and no physical evidence tying anyone to the burials. They did, however, have a timeline, a series of disappearances spanning several years, and a group of victims who shared common risk factors. And that, they hoped, might lead them to whoever had done this. This wasn't the kind of investigation where detectives could knock on doors and make quick arrests. It was slow, forensic work, building from bones, maps, and a long-forgotten timeline of women who'd vanished in the shadows of Albuquerque. In the weeks after the last bone was pulled from the sands of West Mesa, the tone inside the Albuquerque Police Department shifted from shock to strategy. They had 11 women and 1 unborn child, and a graveyard that had been quietly accumulating for years. What they didn't have was their suspect. By early March of 2009, a multi-agency task force was formed to work the case. Detectives from APD joined with the Bernalillo County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and forensic analysis from across the state. They weren't just looking for one killer. They were shifting through years of missing persons reports, old tips, and abandoned leads. The killer had been smart. There were no obvious signs of trauma on many of the remains, no clothing left behind, no DNA to test. Whoever had done this hadn't left the kind of trail investigators could follow with a microscope. They needed to build their case another way, through timelines, geography, and behavior. Detectives would begin by building a timeline of when each woman was last seen. It was immediately clear that the disappearance cluster was between 2001 and 2005. Then they mapped the burial sites on West Mesa. The arrangement wasn't random. The graves were spaced in a way that suggested the killer had returned repeatedly, using roughly the same area of desert over several years. The proximity of the graves combined with the timeline told detectives this wasn't a case of multiple offenders, this looked like one person's dumping ground. They began to cross-reference that information against known offenders in the Albuquerque area. This wasn't the first time that women in Albuquerque had disappeared. Over the years, detectives had accumulated tips about violent Johns, bad dates, and suspicious vehicles around Central Avenue. Many of those reports had never gone anywhere. Now they would be pulled back out, read, reread, and recatalogued. The team began focusing on men with a history of violence against sex workers, particularly anyone who lived or worked near the West Mesa area during the early 2000s. It didn't take long before one name rose to the top: Lorenzo Montoya. Lorenzo Montoya was born in 1966, lived just a few miles from the burial site, and he was known to police. He'd been arrested in the past for soliciting sex workers and had a reputation among women on the street as someone who could become violent quickly. He was also known to cruise Central Avenue late at night. He lived with his mother and worked in a printing plant. By most outward appearances, he was rather unremarkable, quiet, routine, and forgettable. However, investigators learned something that made them take a harder look at him. He was already dead. In December of 2006, 3 years before the discovery of West Mesa, Lorenzo Montoya was shot and killed outside his home. He'd hired a young woman from Central Avenue to come to his house. What happened next matched many of the fears women in the community had whispered about for years. According to police reports, Montoya choked and bound the woman inside his home. Her boyfriend, waiting outside in a car, grew concerned. When she didn't return, he entered the property and caught Montoya in the act. A violent struggle broke out, and the boyfriend shot and killed him on the spot. When police arrived, they found tape, rope, and restraints inside his home. It was the kind of scene that made seasoned detectives uneasy, and now 3 years later, they were looking at a burial site of 11 women, most of whom had vanished while Montoya was alive. The West Mesa killings are believed to have occurred between 2001 and 2005. Lorenzo Montoya lived in the area throughout that period. He had a documented history of targeting sex workers. He was known to cruise the same stretch of Central Avenue where many of the victims were last seen. He also owned a vehicle large enough to transport bodies, a pickup truck. Most crucially, the killings appear to have stopped around 2005, just shortly before Montoya's death. For investigators, that was more than a coincidence. It was one of the strongest circumstantial connections in the entire case. Task force members pulled Montoya's criminal records, interviewed people who knew him, and re-examined the evidence collected during the 2006 homicide at his home. They would find prior arrests for solicitation, a pattern of late-night activity around Central Avenue, known violent encounters with women, and the proximity of his home to the burial site. However, there was a problem. He'd been dead for 3 years when the bodies were found, and there was no direct forensic evidence linking him to West Mesa. No DNA, no witnesses, and no smoking gun. Montoya wasn't the only person investigators looked at. Several other persons of interest emerged over the years. A man was arrested in Colorado with a history of violence against women. A suspected trafficker who operated in Albuquerque during the same period was also looked at, and a few serial offenders who were already incarcerated. All investigated, but none could be definitively tied to the burial site. Some tips came from former sex workers who described being attacked in the area. Others came from family members who suspected specific men. But the case remained circumstantial. The sand had swallowed its secrets. The investigation faced one overwhelming obstacle: time. The women had been buried for years before their discovery. The clothing was gone, decomposition erased trace evidence, and with no ligatures left in the ground, no fingerprints on a weapon, no footprints in the sand, the killer had left behind bones and nothing else. Forensic teams did what they could. They reconstructed skulls, analysed burial positioning, and combed the soil for fragments. But every test came back without the kind of evidence that could point to one person beyond a reasonable doubt. By the end of 2010, the task force had narrowed its focus to Montoya as the most likely suspect. He matched their timeline, the geography, and the victim profile. But because he was dead and because there was no physical evidence, the case remained officially unsolved. Detectives have been candid in the years since. If Montoya was the killer, they may never be able to prove it. Not everyone is convinced Montoya was the only person involved. Some investigators have speculated, quietly, that there may have been more than one offender, or that someone else picked up after Montoya's death. The desert still holds unanswered questions, and the families of the victims still live with the knowledge that no one has ever been formally charged. By the time the last flag had been pulled from the West Mesa dig site in spring of 2009, the landscape was forever changed. What had once been an empty stretch of sand and sagebrush was now a field of memory. 11 women and one unborn child had been recovered, and an entire city was reckoning with the uncomfortable truth that for years their disappearances had gone mostly unnoticed. The case was technically open, but as weeks turned to months, the investigation moved into a quieter phase, one that would last for years. The discovery forced Albuquerque to look directly at a part of itself it had long ignored. The victims were not strangers to the city. They were women who lived in plain sight along Central Avenue, in the shelters, on the sidewalks. Many were mothers, daughters, and sisters. Their disappearances had been reported in many cases, but they hadn't sparked any urgency. And that fact stung. Community leaders and advocacy groups and families began speaking out, not just about the killings, but about the years of silence that came before. The question hanging over Albuquerque wasn't just who had buried those women, it was how so many could disappear without the city even noticing. In the months following the discovery, the area near the burial site became a gathering place. Families placing crosses in the sand, bringing flowers, candles, photos of the women they'd lost. Vigils were held at sunset, the sky glowing pink and orange over the mesa as the names were read aloud. These weren't courtroom hearings or press conferences. They were moments of grief and defiance held in the open air where the women had lain for so many years. As active leads slowed, the West Mesa investigation transitioned to APD's cold case unit. The team continued to field tips, test evidence, and reviewed old reports, and they still do today. Detectives say the case remains one of the most complex investigations in New Mexico's history. Not because there aren't suspects, but because there isn't the kind of evidence that solves cases in court. The prime suspect, Lorenzo Montoya, was dead before the graves were even found. Investigators have publicly acknowledged that if he was responsible, there may never be enough proof to close this case officially. However, they haven't stopped looking. Though investigators have long focused on Montoya, questions still remain. Was he the only person involved? Did someone else pick up where he left off? And did he have help? None of those questions have definitive answers. The FBI has periodically assisted APD in reviewing evidence, and a $100,000 reward remains on the table for information leading to an arrest and conviction. And leads still trickle in. Some are dead ends. Others give detectives reason to dig a little deeper. However, more than a decade later, no one has ever been charged. Today, if you stand on West Mesa at dusk, it's almost impossible to imagine what lies beneath the sand. There's no trace of the massive excavation, no signs of the media storm that once swirled here. But the family's investigators have made sure the memory doesn't fade. For detectives, it's a case that remains open. For families, it's a wound that has never fully healed. For the city of Albuquerque, it's a story that forced uncomfortable questions and demanded change. The desert doesn't speak easily, but when it finally did, it told the story of 11 women who disappeared in plain sight. And the men, or people responsible may never stand in a courtroom. Crime at Bedtime is a Mashed Pumpkin production. Created, hosted and produced by Jack Lawrence. Audio and sound design by Jack Lawrence of Mashed Pumpkin Productions and Dom Evans and James Costa of ESA.